Beyond the tales of daring Viking raids and their formidable longships, there existed a more sinister trade that fueled their prosperity: the transformation of human flesh into ringing coin and women into a means of exchange. In the infamous markets of Dublin, Hedeby, and Birka, enslaved women were not merely property, but living commodities destined for reproduction, ritual sacrifice, and the gratification of wealthy Scandinavians. But what happened behind the walls of these markets? How did Viking laws protect the interests of buyers while ignoring the rights of the sold? And why do archaeological finds tell stories that the sagas prefer to silence? The Vikings didn't just capture prisoners, they industrialized the slave trade. From the 9th to the 11th century, Scandinavian traders transported human cargo across 3 continents. Irish monasteries burned, Saxon villages were emptied, and Slavic settlements disappeared overnight. The survivors found themselves in chains in market squares, where their bodies were converted into silver coins. In 942, wooden slave pens stretched along the gloomy waters of the River Liffey on Dublin's Crane Street. Irish chroniclers called this place the White Slave Market, implying not the color of the chains, but the gleam of silver changing hands. A Scandinavian merchant named Olaf meticulously inspected 23 women captured in Clake. The youngest was barely 12 years old, and the oldest carried a child who would not survive the journey to Iceland. Market prices were determined by simple arithmetic. A healthy woman was valued at 12 ounces of silver by Dublin standards. A pregnant woman at 14, provided the child survived weaning. Damaged goods, women with injuries, branded or morally broken, were sold for 8 ounces or even less. The silver arrived via Islamic trade routes, minted in distant Baghdad and Samarkand, with Arabic script that no one in Dublin could read. Women were not just sold, they were deliberately bred. Much like livestock, 11th century Norwegian laws regulated these practices with chilling precision. A female slave who bore a child to her master gained no rights. The child became the property of the father. If she bore a child to another man, both mother and child could be sold separately or killed at the master's whim. Excavations in Hedeby shed light on these monstrous mechanisms. Analysis of bone remains from slave quarters indicates numerous pregnancies in women aged 15 to 30. Their bones bear traces of stress, malnutrition during pregnancy, multiple fractures, and chronic anemia. One skeleton shows signs of at least 7 births. The woman died at the age of 28. The breeding of female slaves was not accidental. Scandinavian traders selected women based on specific characteristics. Fair-haired Irish and Saxon women were particularly in demand in the markets of Constantinople. Slavic women with craft skills, weaving, metalworking, knowledge of herbs, were sold to wealthy Scandinavian families as valuable assets. Dark-haired Celtic women often remained in Scandinavia as concubines and domestic servants. Religious rituals were often accompanied by violence. Ibn Fadlan describes the funeral rite of the Rus on the Volga in 921. A female slave voluntarily offers to die with her master, believing she will be reunited with him in Valhalla. She is plied with alcohol until unconscious. 10 men rape her aboard the funeral ship while the crowd chants. Then, the angel of death, an old woman with iron teeth and disheveled hair, slits her throat with a curved blade. The girl's body is burned with her master. Her death is meant to ensure his passage to the afterlife. The ritual was repeated throughout the Scandinavian world. In the graves of Birka, paired burials are found. Wealthy men rest beside young women whose necks show signs of knife wounds. The women have no grave goods. They own nothing, even in death. Market law protected the buyer, but never the sold. If a slave escaped, the owner had the right to pursue them throughout Scandinavia. Capture was punished by branding. A hot iron burned a mark on the forehead, warning other communities. A second escape attempt resulted in the severing of tendons, permanently crippling the person. A third attempt was punishable by death. However, the law also established some limitations. Killing another's slave incurred compensation, paid not to the deceased, but to their owner. The compensation amount equaled the purchase price plus the estimated value of their labor. A skilled female slave could cost 20 ounces of silver, while an unskilled worker might be 6 ounces. No compensation was paid for children under hoof until they became productive. The slave trade spawned an entire industry. Professional slave catchers operated throughout Ireland and Britain. They knew which monasteries held treasures, which villages were poorly defended, and during which seasons the population was most vulnerable. Thorvald the Red led raids into remote Scottish valleys. His forces attacked isolated farms during harvest, when men were working away from their weapons. Each raid followed a well-rehearsed pattern. Scouts identified targets weeks in advance. Ships approached the shore at dawn, when defenders were sleeping most soundly. Warriors surrounded settlements, preventing anyone from escaping or warning neighbors. Killings were swift. The elderly, young boys, anyone who could not work or reproduce, were killed without hesitation. Valuable survivors were immediately shackled. Transport ships were equipped with specialized gear, iron shackles of various sizes for men, women, and children, and wooden yokes to prevent movement during long voyages. Ship hulls were reinforced with extra supports, as live cargo was far more mobile than grain or timber. Ventilation holes kept slaves alive during storms, for dead slaves yielded no profit. The rapid growth of the slave trade during the Viking Age led to the formation of complex market mechanisms and standards. Merchants, striving for maximum profit, developed methods for evaluating human cargo. Examining teeth allowed for age and general health assessment, while identifying diseases easily spread in cramped ship holds was crucial to prevent losses. Scars on the slaves' bodies became life stories. Battle wounds indicated a rebellious nature and inclination to resist. Work marks pointed to useful skills. Fresh brands denoted recently captured prisoners, and old ones could warn of behavioral problems. Merchant houses in Birka meticulously recorded transactions, as evidenced by a fragment detailing the acquisition of 43 slaves, 27 women and 16 men, predominantly Irish and Saxons, for 2 and 18 ounces of silver, equivalent to the cost of 3 longships or 60 head of cattle. Notably, 12 women were pregnant, but 5 children did not survive the sea voyage to Sweden. Slave trading became seasonal. Spring raids allowed for capturing people during planting season, when communities were most vulnerable. Summer voyages, thanks to favorable weather, ensured delivery of goods to distant markets. Autumn sales brought in silver needed for winter expenses and preparation for new raids. Winter months were dedicated to planning and ship repairs. Trade routes spanned 3 continents. Scandinavian merchants plied between Dublin and Constantinople, transporting slaves, amber, furs, and walrus ivory. In Bulgar and Khoresm, they met Islamic traders offering silver for Slavic women, who were in demand in wealthy Baghdad households. The silver flowing north financed new raids, ship construction, and chain production. Regional specialization emerged. Ireland supplied fair-haired women, particularly prized in Mediterranean markets. Scotland, strong men for agricultural labor in Iceland and Greenland. Baltic regions, skilled artisans and women proficient in textile crafts. Each of these territories suffered from predatory raids and tried to organize defenses in its own way. Constantinople, one of the largest centers of the slave trade, had a particular demand for northern women. Byzantine aristocrats preferred fair-haired female slaves from Ireland and Scotland, viewing them as exotic trophies, symbolizing wealth and sophisticated taste. The price for a blue-eyed Irish woman in Constantinople could reach 30 gold coins, enough to purchase a small farm or a house in a merchant quarter. This sum included transportation costs, insurance against death or injury during transit, and, of course, the merchant's profit. The journey itself was a true ordeal. Ships designed for 30 warriors carried twice as many slaves in the same space. The diet consisted of dried fish and sour ale, just enough to prevent starvation, but not to maintain strength. Fresh water was rationed strictly. Seasickness and despair broke the spirit of the captives even before arriving at the market. Many died not so much from malnutrition as from homesickness. Specialized infrastructure was developed in market towns. In Dublin, slave quarters covered about 10 acres along the river. Wooden barracks served as temporary shelters for hundreds of captives awaiting sale. Watchtowers prevented escapes. Medical facilities provided care for the sick to increase their market value. Brothels offered wealthy clients the opportunity to sample the goods before purchase. Professional appraisers, like cattle, evaluated human merchandise, determining remaining labor potential, reproductive capacity, and skill level. A woman who could read was valued as a potential household manager. Knowledge of medicinal herbs made slaves indispensable in remote settlements. Musical talents attracted wealthy families seeking entertainment. However, trade required a constant influx of fresh goods. Overly frequent raids on the same territories led to the population learning to hide or resist. After 950, fortified monasteries began to be built in Ireland. Saxon burhs spread in England. Slavic tribes retreated deep into the forests, leaving vulnerable river settlements. Scandinavians were forced to adapt. Instead of random raids, they established bases, winter camps, from which they planned systematic military campaigns. The Great Army, which invaded England in 865, operated like a true corporation. It seized territories, collected tribute, and sold captives in established markets. Human tragedy took on an industrial scale. Various categories of slaves existed, each performing specific functions. Domestic slaves managed households, cooking, cleaning, caring for children, and fulfilling their owners' sexual needs. Field slaves worked in agriculture and construction. Craft slaves possessed valuable skills: metalworking, shipbuilding, textile production. Each category had different legal protections and compensation payments. Manumission, freedom from slavery, was possible but rare. A slave could earn freedom for exceptional service or buy themselves out by accumulating enough silver. Some owners freed old slaves to avoid the cost of their upkeep. Others granted freedom as a deathbed gesture. However, most slaves died in captivity, and their children were born into the same chains. Slaves were not just labor, they were also status symbols. Wealthy Scandinavian families displayed exotic slaves as an indicator of their wealth and power, much like jewels or rare weapons. An Irish harpist, a Saxon embroiderer, or a Slavic jeweler attested to successful raids and the owner's extensive trade connections. Slaves demonstrated their skills at feasts, enhancing their master's social status. Women, in particular, faced harsh conditions as Scandinavian law regarded them primarily as a means of reproduction, secondarily as labor, and almost never as individuals. A female slave who dared to resist sexual violence was subjected to brutal punishments. The fate of her child depended entirely on the father's will. Some owners raised the children of female slaves as future workers, others sold them, and many simply condemned them to death. Contraception became a desperate science. Enslaved women shared knowledge of herbs capable of preventing pregnancy or inducing miscarriage, such as juniper berries, tansy, and pennyroyal. These dangerous plants often killed the woman herself. This knowledge was passed on secretly, as pregnancy only meant new suffering. Slave markets developed their own unique culture. Professional traders emerged, valuing their reputation as honest dealers and suppliers of quality goods. They branded slaves, established transit points, and provided guarantees against disease or early death. In this business, where trust was valued above law, a merchant's word was his primary commitment. The Dublin model of slave trading spread to Cork, Waterford, and Wexford. Hedeby became the center of Baltic trade. Birka controlled Swedish markets, and Kaupang served Norwegian merchants. Each market specialized in certain types of slaves, depending on the directions of raids and trade routes. Price manipulation became an art form. Traders created artificial scarcity by holding back quality goods until peak demand, spreading rumors of upcoming raids that could crash prices. Wealthy buyers received information about the best specimens in advance, while the poor had to settle for lower quality goods at inflated prices. Medical knowledge served profit, not mercy. Traders learned to treat common diseases and injuries to increase the value of slaves. A dead slave brought no income, a sick one was cheap, and a healthy slave was a profitable investment. Dublin became the largest slave market in Western Europe due to its advantageous geographical location, access to the Irish Sea, river routes inland, and established trade links with Scandinavia and other regions. By 980, approximately 3,000 slaves passed through Dublin annually, mostly Irish and Saxons, but also people from North Africa and the Baltic. Competition spurred innovation. Traders offered credit to reliable buyers, delivery services to distant markets, and some even established branches in Constantinople and Baghdad. The most successful traders became wealthy merchants with their own fleets of ships and extensive trade networks. Raiders employed methods of psychological warfare to break the captive's will. Families were separated, children sold to different owners, and spouses sent to different markets. Isolation stripped away hope and prevented resistance. Slaves resisted in various ways, refusing food, committing suicide, or attacking their captors, knowing death awaited them. Most submitted, waiting for a chance that might never come. Broken spirits served as a warning to new arrivals. However, some slaves did fight back. Irish chronicles mention numerous revolts in Scandinavian settlements, which were usually suppressed. Untrained and exhausted slaves could not stand against armed warriors, but successful revolts did occur. In 997, slaves in Waterford killed their guards and set fire to the slave barracks. 43 captives escaped. Scandinavians pursued them throughout Ireland, turning the hunt into a brutal sport. Warriors tracked down fugitives like wild animals, using dogs trained on human scent. Capture often meant public torture, intended to deter other potential runaways. Punishment served several purposes: preventing escapes, entertaining the Scandinavian community, and demonstrating power over slaves. The prosperity of market towns was inextricably linked to human trafficking, forming a specialized economy that served this inhumane trade. Artisans created tools of enslavement, from chains and shackles to brands for marking property. Shipbuilders designed vessels with reinforced holds intended for transporting live cargo. Merchants, in turn, engaged in importing luxury goods used for exchange for slaves, such as silk from Constantinople, spices from Baghdad, and amber from the Baltic. The development of the banking system was another consequence of the slave trade. Silver traders provided loans to finance large transactions, charging interest that reflected the risks associated with transportation and high slave mortality. Currency exchange services ensured the conversion of various silver standards used in Europe and Asia, and letters of credit avoided the need to transport heavy ingots on dangerous journeys. The profitability of this business was astonishing. A successful raid could yield 50 to 100 captives, and profitability, even accounting for deaths and market costs, reached 300% or more. One documented case shows a Scandinavian merchant acquiring 37 Irish slaves for 87 ounces of silver and reselling them in Iceland for 243 ounces, achieving a 280% profit. Simultaneously, Insurance markets emerged to protect human cargo. Merchants paid premiums to cover losses from storms, diseases, or slave deaths during transport, with insurance rates varying depending on the complexity of the route and the quality of the slaves. The most valuable received the best protection, while cheaper ones were transported in dangerous conditions with minimal coverage. The market value of women was determined by their age, appearance, and skills. The highest prices were paid for teenagers, young enough to bear children and old enough to work. Women over 30 decreased in value unless they possessed special skills such as healing knowledge, literacy, or craftsmanship, which could extend their market life to 40 years. Age determination became an important aspect of pricing, and traders carefully examined teeth, skin, and physical development to establish age. Young women often tried to pass themselves off as older, hoping to avoid sexual exploitation, while older women, conversely, lied about their age to avoid being rejected as useless, though deception rarely worked. Human trafficking led to long-term demographic changes. Genetic studies of the modern population of Iceland have revealed significant Celtic ancestry, indicative of thousands of Irish and Scottish women brought there as slaves. Similar patterns are observed in other Scandinavian settlements, where the DNA of enslaved women persists even as their stories vanish from official chronicles. Language barriers were employed as tools of control. Enslaved people, unable to communicate with each other, could not organize resistance, so traders deliberately mixed linguistic groups to prevent coordination. Irish speakers were separated from other Irish speakers, and Slavic languages were forbidden in favor of Scandinavian ones. Communication became a privilege that owners could grant or revoke. Christian authorities condemned the trade in human beings, but were powerless to stop it. Pope John VI issued numerous papal bulls against slavery, but Scandinavian raiders disregarded papal authority. Some Christian merchants still participated in the trade, justifying it by claiming that purchasing enslaved people saved them from a worse fate, though these justifications deceive no one. Profit, not mercy, was the driving force behind the trade. Church officials sometimes bought enslaved people for emancipation, presenting these as acts of charity, but this practice created a moral hazard by providing reliable buyers for slave traders. The church's silver financed new raids and new captives, demonstrating how good intentions could lead to evil outcomes. Scandinavian poetry celebrated successful raids, ignoring their human cost. Skaldic verses lauded warriors, but never mentioned children sold in foreign markets or women who died in childbirth far from home. This literary silence reflects deliberate forgetting, as a heroic culture demanded that certain truths remain buried. However, oral traditions among enslaved peoples preserved different stories. Songs passed down among women contained coded references to native villages, family names, and escape routes. Scandinavians, not understanding the languages, dismissed the singing as harmless amusement, unaware that these songs became threads of life, connecting the present to a lost past. Archaeological evidence tells a different story. Grave goods reveal the wealth generated by the slave trade. Silver hoards in Norway contain Arabic coins used to finance human trafficking, and ship burials include exotic items acquired from slave profits. Physical remains contradict the sanitized saga narratives. Recent excavations have revealed the scale of the trade, uncovering mass graves near trading centers containing hundreds of skeletons with signs of malnutrition and violence. Building foundations incorporate slave quarters into the layout of market towns, and harbor modifications accommodated ships specifically designed for transporting people. The decline of this market began in the late 11th century. In the 11th century, Europe's Christian kingdoms actively fortified their defenses, transforming fortified towns into impregnable strongholds. Legislation increasingly imposed restrictions on slavery, affecting even Scandinavian communities. The Christianization of Scandinavia gradually altered societal norms. And while economic factors played a more significant role than moral considerations, political transformations accelerated the decline of the slave trade. The Norman conquest of England disrupted traditional raiding patterns, and Irish kings united to resist Scandinavian settlements. Slavic principalities organized effective military resistance, eliminating easy targets and making raids more dangerous and less profitable ventures. However, the markets did not vanish without a trace but underwent a significant evolution. Overt slave trading gave way to debt bondage and serfdom. Legal slavery was outlawed, but de facto slavery persisted under other, more veiled names. The chains became invisible, but their shackles remained just as strong. Economic shifts completed this transformation. Increased agricultural productivity led to a reduced demand for enslaved labor, and technological innovations made free laborers more efficient compared to forced ones. A monetary economy supplanted barter systems based on human commodities, rendering the slave trade economically unviable. The final blow came from changes in trade routes. The rise of Italian merchant cities led to the creation of new routes that bypassed traditional Scandinavian networks. The Crusades opened direct connections between Western Europe and the Middle East, stripping Scandinavian intermediaries of their monopolistic position in the slave trade. Administrative records from the period clearly demonstrate this decline. Tax revenues from the Dublin slave market sharply decreased from £1,200 of silver annually in 1020 to £300 in 1060. The number of licenses issued to slave traders fell from 47 in 1040 to 12 in 1080. These figures tell a story of decline that chronicles overlooked. Cultural memory proved to be short-lived. By 1100, Scandinavian sagas rarely mentioned slavery, except in minor details. Christian chroniclers focused on religious conversion rather than economic exploitation. The victims left no written records, and their suffering became invisible to history. Recent excavations at Wood Quay in Dublin have uncovered the foundations of a medieval slave market. Stone platforms where people were displayed for sale like livestock, iron rings to which chains were attached, and a mass grave containing the remains of over 200 individuals. No signs of battle wounds were found on the bones, indicating these were not warriors fallen in combat, but rather those who died awaiting their fate to be sold into slavery, and their silent tragedy still echoes in these stones.